In the quiet shadows of Pinewood Valley, nestled deep within the Appalachian mountains, 12-year-old Elijah Hayes clutched the worn key to his grandfather's abandoned shack. The townsfolk had always whispered about Old Man Hayes and his worthless hovel. But now those whispers turned to outright mockery as the orphaned boy became its unlikely heir. With no parents and no other family, the dilapidated structure perched precariously on the mountainside was all he had left in the world. Tears welled in his eyes as he trudged up the overgrown path, their laughter still ringing in his ears. He inserted the rusty key into the lock, the door creaking open to reveal a dust-covered interior that smelled of memories and secrets. What could possibly be hidden within these decaying walls that his grandfather had protected so fiercely? What treasure could be worth the lifetime of isolation the old man had endured? The musty air inside the shack filled Elijah's lungs as he stepped across the threshold. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light filtering through grimy windows. He stood motionless, taking in what remained of his grandfather's life: a threadbare armchair, shelves of worn books, a small wooden table with a single chair. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he ventured further inside. A week had passed since they'd buried Grandfather Hayes. The funeral had been sparsely attended. Just Elijah, Ms. Patterson, his teacher, old Mr. Wilson from the general store, and a handful of curious onlookers. No tears shed except Elijah's. The whispers had followed him even there. Poor boy. Left with nothing but that old death trap. Old Hayes was touched in the head, living up there all alone. Wonder what'll happen to the kid now? Elijah moved toward a small side table where a framed photograph sat coated in dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, revealing 3 figures, his parents, young and smiling, standing beside Grandfather. Behind them loomed a strange mechanical contraption, wires and gears gleaming in what looked like a workshop. Elijah had no memories of his parents. They had died when he was barely 2, victims of a mountain road that turned treacherous in a sudden storm. His life with Grandfather had been all he'd known. "You'll learn to be self-sufficient, boy," Grandfather had often said, his gnarled hands guiding Elijah's smaller ones through tasks around their modest home in town. "The world won't give you handouts, but it'll respect honest work and a sharp mind." Grandfather had been stern but fair, teaching Elijah mathematics and science from his collection of aging textbooks rather than sending him to the village school. Only after the old man's health began failing 3 years ago had Elijah joined the other children in the one-room schoolhouse, where he'd found himself years ahead in some subjects and hopelessly behind in others. Now, at 12, he was alone with an inheritance nobody wanted. The townspeople had snickered when Mr. Pemberton, the county lawyer, had read the will leaving the mountain property and all its contents to Elijah. Their modest house in town had been rented, the lease now expired. Whatever meager savings Grandfather had possessed had gone to medical bills in his final months. Elijah wandered to the kitchen area, where a cast-iron stove stood cold and empty. The cupboards held a few canned goods, their labels faded. A kerosene lamp sat on the counter, still half full. At least he wouldn't spend his first night in darkness. As evening approached, the shack grew dimmer. Elijah lit the lamp and continued his exploration. In the small bedroom, a narrow cot was covered with a patchwork quilt Grandfather had kept from Elijah's infancy. Beside it sat a trunk that, when opened, revealed neatly folded clothes too large for a boy, but treasures nonetheless. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a leather-bound journal. Elijah carefully unwrapped it and opened to the first page. His grandfather's distinctive handwriting flowed across the yellowed paper. "The work continues, despite their doubts. I cannot risk bringing it to town. Too many prying eyes, too many who would exploit what they do not understand. The boy will inherit it all when the time comes. Until then, I must protect what could change everything." Elijah flipped through pages filled with diagrams, mathematical equations, and passages written in what seemed like code. Many entries mentioned the legacy and the chamber, but offered no clear explanation of either. The last entry, dated just 3 weeks before grandfather's death, read simply, "It is nearly complete. My time grows short, but the boy will finish what I could not." Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed Elijah. The emotional weight of the funeral, the move, and now these cryptic discoveries left him drained. He placed the journal carefully on the small table beside the cot and lay down, pulling the familiar quilt around his shoulders. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. Despite the strangeness of his surroundings, there was an odd comfort in being surrounded by his grandfather's possessions. He clutched the journal close to his chest as his eyes grew heavy. Tomorrow, he would begin to unravel what his grandfather had left behind. Tomorrow, he would start to understand why the old man had spent so many hours away from town, up here in this remote shack that everyone thought worthless. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would discover what legacy awaited him, as sleep claimed him. Elijah's final thought was of the strange contraption in the photograph and the look of fierce pride in his grandfather's eyes as he stood before it. Morning light streamed through the dusty windows as Elijah woke with a start. Momentarily confused by his surroundings, the journal lay open on his chest, its pages illuminated by the sunbeam. He sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and examined the mysterious book more carefully. The symbols inked across the pages were unlike anything he'd seen before. Circles intersecting with triangles, numbers arranged in peculiar sequences, and diagrams that seemed to depict machinery beyond his understanding. Some pages contained what appeared to be coordinates, while others held long passages in a substitution cipher where letters had been replaced with symbols. "You've got a mind for patterns." Elijah, his grandfather, had often said during their mathematics lessons at the kitchen table. "See how the numbers dance together? There's music in mathematics if you know how to listen." Those lessons came back to him now as he traced a finger along a sequence of numbers: 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23. Prime numbers, but arranged in a spiral pattern on the page. Nearby, his grandfather had sketched what appeared to be the shack itself, but with dotted lines extending below the foundation. Elijah set the journal aside and began a more thorough exploration of the cabin. In daylight, he could see details missed the previous evening. The floorboards near the small wood stove showed unusual wear patterns, as if something heavy had been dragged across them repeatedly. One section of the rear wall was constructed with slightly different wood than the rest. The color variation subtle but noticeable to his attentive eye. He ran his hands over the walls, feeling for inconsistencies. His grandfather had taught him to observe closely. "The world reveals its secrets to patient eyes," he would say, encouraging Elijah to notice the smallest details of a bird's nest or the structure of a snowflake. The journal mentioned something called the chamber repeatedly. Could there be a hidden room somewhere within or beneath the shack? Elijah returned to the worn floorboards, kneeling to examine them more closely. Small grooves had been cut into certain boards, not randomly, but in a pattern that reminded him of the strange symbols from the journal. A knock at the door interrupted his investigation. Elijah froze, uncertain who would venture up the mountain path to visit. After a moment's hesitation, he opened the door to find Ms. Patterson, his teacher from the village school, holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Good morning, Elijah," she said with a gentle smile. "I thought you might need some provisions." "May I come in?" Elijah stepped aside, suddenly aware of how unkempt both he and the shack must appear. Miss Patterson entered, her eyes taking in the dusty interior with a careful neutrality that Elijah appreciated. Unlike others in town, she had never spoken ill of his grandfather. "I brought some bread, cheese, and preserves," she said, placing the basket on the small table, "and some fresh apples from my tree." Her eyes fell on the open journal. "Your grandfather's notes?" Elijah nodded. "Did you know him well?" Miss Patterson ran a hand along the spine of a book on the nearby shelf. "Better than most, I suppose. Before he became so reclusive, Joshua Hayes was known as quite the intellectual. Some said he attended university back east before returning to these mountains. She turned to Elijah. There were rumors he was an inventor of some renown. An inventor? Elijah thought of the strange contraption in the photograph. Yes, though he never spoke of it to me directly. But occasionally, when he'd come to town for supplies, I'd notice papers protruding from his pockets, diagrams similar to these. She gestured to the open journal. When I asked, he would simply smile and say he was working on the future. She stayed only a short while longer, promising to check on him again in a few days and reminding him that the school year would begin in 2 weeks. After she left, Elijah turned his attention back to the journal with renewed interest. One page contained a sketch of what appeared to be the cabin's floor plan, with an X marked in the corner furthest from the door. Elijah moved to that spot, examining the floorboards with greater scrutiny. They seemed ordinary enough, but when he pressed his weight against them, he detected the slightest give, different from the solid construction elsewhere. Another page showed a sequence of symbols arranged in a circle, with one symbol resembling an hourglass, repeated at cardinal points. The same symbol, he now realized, had been subtly carved into the 4 corners of the room, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. The connections weren't yet clear, but Elijah felt certain his grandfather had left these clues deliberately. As evening approached, he lit the kerosene lamp again and spread the journal pages across the floor, determined to decode whatever message lay hidden within the mysterious symbols. His grandfather had believed him capable of understanding this legacy. He would not let that faith be misplaced. After 3 days of careful study, Elijah began to make sense of his grandfather's cryptic notes. The symbols weren't entirely a code. Many corresponded to electrical circuits and mechanical components, drawn with modifications that suggested improvements to existing designs. The old man had been documenting his inventions, creating his own shorthand to protect his work. Elijah sat in his grandfather's worn armchair, flexing his stiff muscles after hours hunched over the journal. Something about the chair felt odd. The right armrest seemed to have a different density than the left. He ran his fingers along the wooden frame, pressing gently until he felt a subtle click. A small compartment opened in the armrest, revealing a brass object nestled within. He carefully extracted what appeared to be an antique compass, its surface etched with the same strange symbols found throughout the journal. But this was unlike any compass he'd seen in his geography books. Instead of the cardinal directions, the face displayed the hourglass symbol he'd noticed carved into the room's corners. When Elijah held the compass flat in his palm, the needle spun erratically before settling in a direction that wasn't north, pointing directly toward the back wall of the shack. He moved slowly across the room, watching as the needle adjusted, always oriented toward the same section of wall. When he approached the area where the floorboards had given slightly under his weight, the compass needle began to tremble. "The chamber," Elijah whispered, remembering his grandfather's journal entries. He knelt on the floor, compass in hand, watching as the needle vibrated more intensely the closer it came to the worn floorboards. Using his fingers, he traced the edges of the boards, looking for any irregularity. Near the wall, one board moved slightly when pressed. Setting the compass aside, Elijah dug his fingernails into the small gap and pulled. The floorboard lifted, revealing a dark space beneath. Heart pounding, he retrieved the kerosene lamp and held it over the opening. Below was not dirt as he'd expected, but a small cavity containing a metal box approximately the size of a bread loaf. The box was secured with a combination lock featuring 3 dials with numbers from 1 to 20. Elijah carried the box to the table, setting it beside the open journal. The lock would require the correct sequence to open. He flipped through the journal pages, searching for number patterns that might serve as the combination. Several pages contained sequences of 3 numbers, but which was the correct one? He recalled his grandfather's fondness for prime numbers, evident in many of the journal's calculations. One sequence appeared repeatedly throughout the notes, 7:13:19, all primes, and each separated by 6. Elijah turned the dials to match these numbers, but the lock remained secure. He tried other combinations from the journal, each without success. Frustration mounting, he returned to the first pages, reading more carefully. On the third page, in the upper corner, was a small notation he'd overlooked. "The chamber guards what matters most. Remember your beginning, his beginning." Elijah pondered what this might mean. His birthday was March 17th, so perhaps 3 to 17. But the lock required 3 numbers. What else could signify his beginning? Then he remembered. His parents had died when he was 2 years old, 2, and they had died on October 23rd. Hands trembling slightly, he turned the dials to 10:2:23. A soft click, and the lock opened. Before he could lift the lid, voices outside caught his attention. Through the grimy window, he spotted 3 boys from the village making their way up the path to the shack. At their head was Thomas Blackwood, the mayor's son, whose favorite pastime seemed to be making Elijah's school days miserable. "Crazy Hayes' place looks even worse up close," Thomas called to his companions, loud enough for Elijah to hear through the thin walls. "Let's see what the orphans inherited. Probably nothing but rat droppings and cobwebs." Quickly, Elijah returned the metal box to its hiding place beneath the floorboard, covering it with the loose plank. The compass he slipped into his pocket just as heavy footsteps mounted the porch steps. "Hey, orphan boy," Thomas shouted, banging on the door. "We know you're in there. Come out and show us your fancy inheritance." Elijah remained silent, watching through a crack in the curtains as Thomas cupped his hands against the window, peering inside. The boy's face, distorted through the warped glass, twisted into a sneer. Not even a proper house. "Just a shack that'll probably collapse in the next big storm." Thomas turned to his friends. "My father says the old man was offered good money for this land, but he was too crazy to sell." Now this runt stuck with it. They circled the shack, rattling windows and laughing. Elijah held his breath, one hand closed tightly around the compass in his pocket, until finally they grew bored and retreated down the mountain path, their mocking voices fading into the distance. Only when they were truly gone did Elijah exhale. Whatever secrets the metal box contained, he knew instinctively that they must be protected from prying eyes. Tonight, when darkness would shield any light from being visible from the village below, he would examine its contents and continue unraveling his grandfather's legacy. 4 days of solitude in the shack had depleted Elijah's meager food supplies. Ms. Patterson's basket had sustained him longer than expected, but now necessity drove him back to the village. He tucked his grandfather's journal beneath a loose floorboard, pocketed the brass compass, and began the winding descent down the mountain trail. Pinewood Valley emerged into view as he rounded the final bend, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in the valley floor, smoke curling from chimneys, the white steeple of the small church rising above the pines. Once he had found comfort in this sight. Now, anxiety knotted his stomach at the thought of facing the townspeople's whispers. The general store's bell jangled as Elijah entered. Mr. Wilson looked up from his ledger, adjusting his spectacles as recognition dawned. "Young Hayes," he said with a nod. "Wondered when we'd be seeing you. Settling in up there, are you?" Elijah nodded, relieved at the old shopkeeper's matter-of-fact tone. He gathered the most essential supplies: flour, salt, beans, matches, items that would keep well and sustain him. His grandfather had taught him to be frugal, a lesson more crucial than ever now that his future was so uncertain. As he placed his selections on the counter, the store's door opened. Mayor Blackwood entered, his imposing frame filling the doorway. Beside him stood his son Thomas, whose smirk widened upon spotting Elijah. "Wilson," the mayor acknowledged gruffly. "Just the usual account, please." The shopkeeper nodded, turning to prepare the Blackwoods' regular order. Meanwhile, Mayor Blackwood's gaze fell on Elijah, his expression a practiced blend of condescension and false sympathy. "Ah, the Hayes boy. Quite the inheritance you've received, lad." His voice carried to the far corners of the store, where other customers pretended not to listen. "That old shack's been an eyesore on the mountainside for years. Your grandfather was," he paused, "eccentric in his attachment to the property. Joshua Hayes wasn't one to part with what he valued." "Sir," Mr. Wilson interjected mildly as he wrapped tobacco for the mayor. "Valued. That land's worth something, certainly, but not with that ramshackle structure contaminating it." Mayor Blackwood chuckled. "My company offered your grandfather a fair sum many times over. Could have lived comfortably in his final years instead of what, Edward?" Mr. Wilson's voice took on an edge rarely heard from the mild-mannered shopkeeper. "Instead of maintaining his independence, making his own choices." The mayor's face tightened. "Instead of leaving his orphaned grandson destitute with nothing but a worthless hovel," he turned to Elijah. "When you come to your senses, boy, my office is always open. That land adjoins the northern mining tract. Blackwood Mining would still make you a reasonable offer." Thomas snickered. "Better sell quick, orphan, before it falls down around your ears." Elijah focused on counting out his coins, ignoring the flush of heat in his cheeks. The mayor collected his purchases and departed with a final, meaningful look, Thomas trailing behind with a backward glance that promised future torment. Once they'd gone, Mr. Wilson sighed heavily. "Don't mind Edward Blackwood, son. He's had his eye on your grandfather's land for a decade. Claims there are mineral deposits worth extracting." "My grandfather never mentioned mining," Elijah said quietly. "Joshua wasn't much for sharing his business," Mr. Wilson agreed, then lowered his voice. "But between us, your grandfather wasn't just some mountain hermit. Man had an education, ideas, brilliant ones, some said." The shopkeeper disappeared into the storeroom, returning with a cardboard box. "Been holding on to this. Your grandfather left it here for safekeeping about 2 years back. Said if anything happened to him, it should go to you when you were ready." He slid the box across the counter. "Figured now's as good a time as any." Elijah peered inside to find a stack of yellowing newspaper clippings, some dating back 20 years or more. The topmost headline caught his eye. "Hayes Innovation Promises Revolution in Energy Production." Beneath it, a grainy photograph showed a younger version of his grandfather, standing proudly beside a device similar to the one in the family photograph. "There was a time when Joshua Hayes was considered the brightest mind to come out of these mountains," Mr. Wilson said. "Then something happened. He withdrew, became private about his work. Some folks thought he'd failed, gone a bit touched in the head. Others," the shopkeeper tapped his temple, "others thought he'd discovered something worth protecting." Elijah carefully closed the box. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. You watch yourself up there, boy. And if you need anything at all, you come see old Wilson, you hear?" With his supplies and the precious box of clippings, Elijah started back toward the mountain trail. He felt eyes following him through the village, some curious, some pitying, some calculating. Near the trailhead, he glanced back and noticed a figure ducking behind the feed store. Thomas Blackwood, no doubt, up to mischief. Clutching his parcels tighter, Elijah quickened his pace up the mountain path, a new urgency in his steps. The newspaper clippings might hold answers to his grandfather's mysterious past. And more importantly, they might explain why the mayor was so interested in a seemingly worthless plot of land, and what secrets might truly lie hidden within his inheritance. Night had fallen by the time Elijah returned to the shack. After securing the door with the crude bolt his grandfather had installed, he spread the newspaper clippings across the table and examined them by lamplight. The articles spanned nearly 2 decades, chronicling Joshua Hayes's journey from promising young engineer to reclusive inventor. The earliest pieces described his grandfather's education at a prestigious university and early career developing efficient mechanical systems. Later articles detailed controversial theories about sustainable energy production that had been dismissed by his contemporaries. The most recent clipping, dated 15 years ago, announced that Hayes had withdrawn from public life to continue his research independently after a dispute with potential investors. These fragments painted a picture of a brilliant but uncompromising man who had retreated to his mountain sanctuary rather than surrender control of his inventions to those who might exploit them. Elijah felt a growing sense of pride, tinged with urgency. If his grandfather's work had truly been valuable enough to drive corporate interest, then the mayor's casual offer to purchase the land took on a more sinister dimension. Replacing the clippings in their box, Elijah retrieved the metal container from beneath the floorboard. The brass compass lay heavy in his pocket as he set the box on the table and carefully lifted its lid. Inside lay a mechanical device unlike anything he'd seen before, a brass lever attached to a complex arrangement of gears and springs, all fitted onto a flat mounting plate with strange markings along its edge. Elijah extracted the lever mechanism and examined it closely. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each component precisely machined and fitted. The plate's markings matched symbols from the journal, including the recurring hourglass. On the underside, his grandfather had engraved, "The key to what lies beneath." The compass in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. Elijah withdrew it and watched as the needle pointed insistently toward the rear wall of the shack. The same wall with the slight variation in wood color he'd noticed days earlier. Heart pounding, Elijah approached the wall, compass in one hand, lever mechanism in the other. The compass needle trembled more violently as he neared the wall's center. Upon closer inspection, he discovered a nearly invisible seam running along one section. When he pressed his hand against this area, he felt the slightest give, not the solid resistance of a supporting wall. Examining the wall more carefully, Elijah noticed a small indentation that matched the shape of the lever's mounting plate. Taking a deep breath, he positioned the mechanism against the wall, aligning the marks with the nearly imperceptible seams. The plate fit perfectly into the shallow recess. As if designed specifically for this spot, with trembling fingers, Elijah grasped the brass lever and pulled. A series of soft clicks emanated from within the wall, followed by a mechanical whir. Slowly, a section of the wall, approximately 3 feet wide and 5 feet high, receded inward and then slid aside, revealing a dark opening beyond. Cool air wafted from the darkness, carrying a hint of metal and oil. Elijah lifted his lamp, its light illuminating a narrow staircase descending into the mountain itself. The stairs, carved from stone and reinforced with metal supports, disappeared into shadow beyond the lamp's reach. Along the walls ran copper pipes and bundles of wires, suggesting something complex waited below. Gathering his courage, Elijah began the descent. The stairway extended perhaps 20 feet downward before opening into a space that stole his breath away. His grandfather hadn't built a shack on the mountainside. He had built a door to something far more extraordinary. The hidden chamber was vast, at least 3 times the size of the shack above. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools, components, and half-assembled devices. Glass-fronted cabinets contained notebooks, technical drawings, and material samples. In the center stood a large machine, partially covered by a canvas tarp. Its exposed sections revealing gleaming brass, copper, and steel crafted into an intricate assembly. Elijah moved deeper into the workshop, lamp held high. The space showed signs of recent activity, tools arranged for easy access, a chair pulled back from one workbench, as if his grandfather had just stepped away momentarily. On the main workbench lay a set of blueprints weighted down with small metal parts. The top sheet, bearing the title, Hayes Atmospheric Energy Converter, Final Design Specifications. As he leaned closer to examine the blueprints, the flame in his lamp flickered. A subtle draft whispered through the chamber. Elijah froze, listening intently. From above came the unmistakable sound of the shack's door opening, followed by the creak of floorboards under an unfamiliar step. Someone had entered the shack. Elijah quickly dimmed the lamp, plunging the hidden chamber into near darkness. The footsteps above continued, moving methodically across the floor, searching. A male voice muttered something indistinct. Then, worryingly, the footsteps approached the rear wall, where the hidden entrance stood open. Elijah pressed himself against the wall beside the staircase, heart hammering in his chest. A beam of light cut through the darkness as a lantern illuminated the top of the stairs. Then, silhouetted against the light from the shack, a figure appeared in the doorway, the unmistakable profile of Thomas Blackwood, the mayor's son. "Hayes?" Thomas's voice echoed down the stairwell. "I know you're down there. I can see the light." Elijah remained frozen, mind racing. There was nowhere to hide in the open workshop, no way to escape. Thomas's footsteps descended the stairs, his lantern beam sweeping the space. "This is private property," Elijah finally called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. "You're trespassing." Thomas reached the bottom of the stairs, his lantern illuminating his face, a mixture of shock and fascination, replacing his usual sneer as he took in the vast workshop. "Holy," Thomas whispered, moving deeper into the chamber. "Your crazy old grandpa built all this? Inside the mountain?" "He wasn't crazy," Elijah said, stepping forward. "And you need to leave, now." Thomas ignored him, approaching the central machine with undisguised awe. "What is this thing? Some kind of generator? It's none of your business. Your father wants this land? Well, now I know why." Thomas turned, his expression hardening. "My father doesn't know about this." "Not exactly," he hesitated. "He knows your grandfather was working on something valuable. Something about energy production. That's why he's been trying to buy this land for years." "To steal my grandfather's invention," Elijah said bitterly. "To develop the resources," Thomas corrected, though uncertainty flickered across his face. "Look, I just came to see what you were hiding. My father said to keep an eye on you, see if you found anything interesting, so you could report back to him, so he could take it from me." Thomas didn't answer immediately, his attention caught by the blueprints on the workbench. "Hayes atmospheric energy converter," he read aloud. "This thing, it generates electricity from air." Despite himself, Elijah felt a surge of pride. "From atmospheric pressure differentials and thermal energy, according to my grandfather's notes. That would be revolutionary." Thomas's voice had lost its mocking edge. "Do you have any idea what something like this would be worth?" "It's not about money," Elijah said firmly. "My grandfather could have sold this years ago if that's what he wanted." Thomas circled the machine, examining it with surprising knowledge. "My father's mining company has been struggling since the main coal seams started thinning out. That's why he's been so determined to acquire new properties." He glanced at Elijah. "If this really works, it would make the mines obsolete." The realization hung between them. Mayor Blackwood's interest in the land might not be about claiming the invention, but about preventing it from ever reaching the public. "You need to leave," Elijah insisted again, "before you get ideas about telling your father." "And if I don't?" Thomas challenged, though with less conviction than usual. "You going to make me? Orphan boy against the mayor's son?" Elijah reached for the brass lever he'd set down on a nearby workbench. "I'll seal this place up. My grandfather built it to be hidden. I'm betting there's more than one way to secure it." Thomas looked skeptical, but also reluctant to test the theory. His gaze swept the chamber again, lingering on a large roll of yellowed paper tucked into a tube on one wall. "What's that?" Elijah followed his gaze. He hadn't noticed the tube during his initial exploration. Setting down his lamp, he carefully extracted what proved to be an old mining map, its edges crumbling with age. Spread across a workbench, the map revealed a network of tunnels throughout the mountain, many extending well beyond the boundaries of his grandfather's property. "These must be the old silver mines," Thomas said, leaning closer. "They were abandoned decades ago when the veins ran dry. My father's company has been planning to reopen some sections to search for overlooked deposits." Elijah noted something peculiar. Several tunnels converged near the location of the hidden chamber, including one that seemed to connect directly to it. His grandfather hadn't just built the workshop. He'd incorporated existing mine tunnels into his design. "There's a tunnel here," Elijah said, pointing to a passage marked with the now familiar hourglass symbol. "It looks like it might lead to the workshop." "Your grandfather was clever," Thomas admitted. "Built his laboratory in a place with multiple escape routes." He studied the map further. "Some of these tunnels run beneath my father's property, beneath the whole town, actually." An uneasy silence fell between them as the implications sank in. If Mayor Blackwood learned of the hidden chamber and its revolutionary invention, he wouldn't stop until he controlled it, one way or another. "You can't tell him," Elijah said firmly. "Whatever is between us at school, this is different. This is bigger." Thomas seemed torn, ambition warring with something else in his expression. "What exactly are you planning to do with all this, Hayes? You're 12. You can't exactly manufacture and distribute a revolutionary energy device by yourself." It was a fair question, one Elijah hadn't fully considered in the excitement of discovery. "I don't know yet, but my grandfather wanted me to find this. He left all those clues for me, not for your father's company to exploit." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting from the massive machine to the extensive workshop to the map with its web of escape routes. Finally he sighed. "Look, I won't tell my father, not yet anyway. But in return, I want to see how this thing works. I've been studying engineering in my free time. Maybe I could help you figure it out." Elijah regarded him warily. "Why would you help me?" A complicated expression crossed Thomas's face. "Because my father has our whole lives planned out. The mines, the company, everything. But this," he gestured at the invention, "this is actually interesting. It might be a trick, but Elijah saw something sincere in Thomas's enthusiasm. And truthfully, he could use help understanding his grandfather's complex creation." "Fine," Elijah said cautiously. "But we set some ground rules. And the first one is, no one else knows about this place. Not your friends, not your father. No one." Thomas nodded, extending his hand. "Deal." As they shook hands, Elijah couldn't help but wonder if he was making a terrible mistake, or finding an unlikely ally in the most unexpected place. Dawn broke over the mountain as Elijah and Thomas cleared decades of dust from the workshop. Their unlikely alliance had survived the night, strengthened by shared amazement at each new discovery. Behind the canvas top stood Joshua Hayes' masterpiece, a complex apparatus of copper coils, brass fittings, and crystalline components arranged in a configuration neither boy fully understood. "Your grandfather was a genius," Thomas admitted, wiping grime from a glass pressure gauge. "This isn't just theoretical. He actually built it." Elijah nodded, carefully cleaning a control panel marked with his grandfather's distinctive symbols. "But is it finished? And does it actually work?" Thomas examined the central mechanism, where a small glass chamber housed what appeared to be a miniature version of the larger machine. "I think this is a prototype, a working model to prove the concept." Elijah opened another of his grandfather's journals he'd discovered on a workshop shelf. Unlike the coded notebook he'd found upstairs, this one contained straightforward technical documentation, including operational procedures for the prototype. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "The atmospheric differential converter successfully generated sustainable power for 72 consecutive hours in Trial 17, producing sufficient electricity to power basic applications with zero fuel consumption." He did it, Thomas. He created an engine that runs on air pressure and temperature differences. Thomas whistled softly. "Do you have any idea what something like this would be worth?" "It could revolutionize energy production. No coal, no oil, minimal environmental impact." "Which explains these," Elijah said, pulling open a drawer filled with letters. The correspondence, spanning nearly a decade, included offers from energy companies, manufacturing firms, and even government agencies, all proposing partnerships, buyouts, or exclusive licensing agreements. All had been firmly declined. One letter caught his attention, dated just 6 months before his grandfather's death, on Blackwood Mining Company letterhead. Mayor Blackwood had offered $1 million for the property. No questions asked about any research materials that might be found there. Thomas read the letter over Elijah's shoulder, his expression darkening. "My father never mentioned offering that much money. He just said your grandfather was stubborn about selling worthless land." Worthless. Elijah gestured around the workshop. He knew, maybe not exactly what was here, but enough to make that kind of offer. They continued sorting through documents, finding patents for earlier inventions, scientific papers, and personal correspondence. A letter from Elijah's father, dated shortly before his parents' fatal accident, revealed that he had been helping with the project, believing in his father's vision of energy independence for all, not just those who can afford to exploit limited resources. "Your grandfather turned down millions," Thomas said, scanning another declined offer. "Why? Most people would have sold in a heartbeat." Elijah considered the question as he examined his grandfather's notes. "He writes here about power belonging to the people. I think he was worried that if large companies controlled his invention, they'd restrict access or make it too expensive for ordinary people to benefit. Like what happened with the electrical grid in rural areas." Thomas nodded. "My grandfather told me stories about how these mountains didn't get electricity until decades after cities had it, because companies didn't see profit in running lines to remote communities. As morning turned to afternoon, they focused on understanding the prototype. Following the journal's instructions, they carefully checked connections, adjusted settings, and prepared for a test activation." "Are we sure about this?" Thomas asked, hand hovering over the main switch. "What if it explodes or something?" "My grandfather ran it successfully before," Elijah said, with more confidence than he felt. "According to his notes, the worst that could happen is it fails to generate power." Thomas nodded, took a deep breath, and flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a gentle hum emanated from the device, growing steadily in pitch. The glass chamber at the center began to glow with a soft blue light as gauges flickered to life. A small bank of light bulbs connected to the output terminals gradually illuminated, casting warm light across the workshop. "It works," Elijah whispered, awe in his voice. "It really works." Thomas stared at the glowing bulbs, then at the machine consuming no visible fuel, yet producing steady power. "This changes everything, Hayes. Do you understand that? This could make fossil fuels obsolete, which is exactly why my father would do anything to control it," came a voice from the stairway. Both boys whirled to find Mayor Blackwood standing at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by two men in suits. His cold smile did not reach his eyes as he surveyed the workshop. "Thomas," he said with quiet disappointment, "I expected better from you." "Father," Thomas began, stepping forward, "you don't understand. This invention could transform the valley, create new jobs." "Jobs?" Mayor Blackwood laughed without humor. "This would destroy jobs. What happens to every miner, every truck driver, every processor in our operation when energy comes from thin air?" He turned to one of the suited men. "Document everything. I want detailed photographs and measurements." "This doesn't belong to you," Elijah said, finding his voice. "My grandfather left it to me." The mayor regarded him with something between pity and contempt. "Your grandfather was a selfish old fool who could have provided for you instead of chasing impossible dreams." He gestured around the workshop. "All this brilliance wasted in hiding, but no longer." As the men moved further into the workshop, Elijah caught Thomas's eye and subtly gestured toward the prototype. Thomas gave an almost imperceptible nod before addressing his father. "How did you find this place?" The mayor smiled thinly. "You weren't exactly subtle, son. Did you really think I wouldn't have someone watching the Hayes property? When my man reported you'd entered and not come out by morning, it wasn't difficult to deduce you'd found something interesting." While the mayor spoke, Thomas casually repositioned himself beside the prototype. In one swift movement, he disconnected a crucial component and slipped it into his pocket. The following morning, Elijah woke to sunlight streaming through the shack's grimy windows. For a moment, the events of the previous day seemed like a dream. The working prototype, Mayor Blackwood's intrusion, the heated confrontation that had followed. But the reality was all too clear. The mayor had given him 48 hours to consider a generous offer before he would return with county officials to inspect the property for safety violations. Thomas had been ordered home, his betrayed expression haunting Elijah as the mayor practically dragged his son up the stairs. Before leaving, Thomas had managed to whisper, "I took the activation crystal. They can document it all they want, but it won't work without it." Now Elijah sat at the small table, a mug of weak tea growing cold between his hands. Thomas had promised to return today to help formulate a plan, but doubt gnawed at him. Could he really trust the mayor's son? Or had yesterday's alliance been a calculated move to gain access to the workshop? By noon, there was still no sign of Thomas. Elijah descended to the workshop alone, taking inventory of what remained. The mayor's men had photographed everything but taken nothing yet. The prototype sat dark and silent, its central chamber empty, where Thomas had removed the crucial component. Elijah immersed himself in his grandfather's notes, trying to understand the full scope of the invention. The atmospheric energy converter didn't just generate small amounts of electricity. The complete version could potentially power an entire town using only natural temperature and pressure differentials. No pollution, no fuel costs, no resource depletion. Just clean, renewable energy available to anyone. No wonder his grandfather had been so protective. In the wrong hands, such technology could be suppressed, monopolized, or weaponized. In the right hands, it could transform lives, especially in remote communities like Pinewood Valley, where resources were limited and poverty widespread. As afternoon faded toward evening with still no sign of Thomas, Elijah was forced to accept that help might not be coming. He needed another ally, someone with knowledge of local regulations who might help him protect his inheritance from the mayor's machinations. Just as he prepared to lock up and seek out Ms. Patterson, he heard footsteps on the porch. The door opened to reveal not Thomas, but one of the suited men from yesterday, identified by the mayor as Mr. Reynolds, the company lawyer. "Mr. Hayes," Reynolds said formally, as if addressing an adult rather than a 12-year-old boy. "I've brought paperwork for your review. Mayor Blackwood is prepared to offer $50,000 for the property, a generous sum considering your circumstances." "My grandfather was offered $1 million, Elijah replied, surprising the lawyer. "It's in writing," Reynolds recovered quickly. "That offer was predicated on certain assumptions about what your grandfather possessed. Now that we've had an opportunity to assess the actual value, you mean now that you think you can take it by force for less?" Elijah interrupted. "The invention works. You saw it. I saw an interesting science project," Reynolds countered smoothly. "But without proper documentation, patents, or proof of practical application at scale, its commercial value is speculative at best." He placed a folder on the table. "Consider the offer carefully. A boy in your position, with no parents and limited resources, would be wise to secure his future." After Reynolds departed, Elijah opened the folder. The contract inside was filled with legal terminology he barely understood, but the intent was clear. In exchange for $50,000, he would transfer all rights to the property and any intellectual assets discovered therein to Blackwood Mining Company. As night fell, Elijah finally heard the approach he'd been waiting for. Quick, light footsteps he recognized as Thomas's. But when the boy entered, his usual confidence was gone, replaced by a strange mixture of defiance and shame. "You said you'd come earlier," Elijah said, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. "My father had me followed," Thomas replied. "I couldn't get away until now." He reached into his pocket, then hesitated. "Elijah, I need to tell you something." The use of his first name, not Hayes or orphan boy, sent a warning signal through Elijah's mind. "My father, he's not just after the land. He's known about your grandfather's work for years. There's a mineral deposit under this mountain, a rare crystal formation, the same type of crystal used in your grandfather's invention. The activation component," Elijah realized. "That's why it works here on this mountain." Thomas nodded grimly. "My father's company has been trying to extract it quietly, through legal channels. But your grandfather's property sits directly above the richest vein." He drew a deep breath. "I didn't know all this yesterday. My father explained everything last night, how the mining operation could bring prosperity to the valley. how your grandfather's invention threatened not just his company, but the livelihoods of everyone who depends on it. A cold dread settled in Elijah's stomach. "You're taking his side." "I'm trying to see both sides," Thomas insisted. "My father made some compelling arguments. This town has been dying since the main mines closed. People need jobs, Elijah, and they could have them with my grandfather's invention. Clean energy production, manufacturing, years from now, maybe. After testing, certification, investment." Thomas looked torn. "My father's operation could begin within months. People can't wait years for theoretical benefits." Elijah stared at his former ally, understanding washing over him. "You're not here to help me. You're here to convince me to sell." Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the crystal component. "I brought this back." "It belongs to you." He set it on the table. "But yes, I think you should consider my father's offer. And if I don't—" Thomas's expression hardened. "He'll get the land one way or another. If not by purchase, then by condemning the property as unsafe, or by challenging your right to live here alone as a minor, or through tax liens when you can't pay the property taxes." He sighed. "You're 12, Elijah. You can't win this fight." As Thomas turned to leave, Elijah noticed something off about the crystal. Its color seemed duller, its structure slightly different from what he remembered. He picked it up, examining it closely. "This isn't the original component," he said quietly. Thomas paused at the door, not turning around. "I don't know what you mean. This is a replica. A good one, but not the same. The original had a flaw, a small inclusion on the left facet." Elijah's voice hardened. "You kept the real one. Or your father has it." Thomas's shoulders slumped slightly. "I'm sorry, Elijah. I really am." He opened the door. "Consider the offer, please." After Thomas departed, Elijah sat in stunned silence, betrayal burning in his chest. Not only had he lost his only ally, but now the mayor possessed a crucial component of his grandfather's invention, perhaps enough to reverse engineer the technology while bypassing Elijah entirely. Elijah awoke before dawn, a plan forming in his mind. He couldn't fight the mayor alone. He needed allies, information, and leverage. Most of all, he needed to understand why his grandfather had chosen this particular mountain for his workshop, and what made the crystals found here so special. As the first light broke over the valley, he made his way down the mountain path toward the schoolhouse. If anyone would know the valley's history, it would be Ms. Patterson, whose family had lived in Pinewood for generations. The schoolhouse stood empty in the summer quiet, but a thin curl of smoke from the chimney suggested Miss Patterson was already at work, preparing for the coming term. She answered his knock with surprise that quickly turned to concern. "Elijah, are you all right? You look like you haven't slept." "I need your help, Miss Patterson," he said, the words tumbling out. "It's about my grandfather's property. Mayor Blackwood is trying to take it, and I don't understand why it's so important to him." Her expression shifted subtly. "You'd better come in." She ushered him inside, where papers and textbooks lay in neat stacks. "I've heard rumors that Edward Blackwood visited your grandfather's property. People talk in a small town. He found something my grandfather built. Something important." Elijah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "And now he's trying to force me to sell the land." Miss Patterson studied him for a long moment. "There's something you should see," she said finally. "Something that might explain why that mountain has always been so valuable." She led him to a locked cabinet at the back of the schoolroom and withdrew a large leather-bound volume, the town's historical record dating back to its founding. "Your family has a longer history here than most realize," she said, turning yellowed pages carefully. "The Hayes name appears in the very first census of Pinewood Valley." The page she indicated showed a map of the original settlement, with property boundaries clearly marked. To Elijah's surprise, the Hayes family's land grant included not just the mountain where his grandfather's shack stood, but a significant portion of what was now Blackwood Mining Company property. "Your ancestors were among the founders of Pinewood Valley," Miss Patterson explained. "They were granted mineral rights in perpetuity, a legal term meaning forever, as part of the original settlement charter. But the Blackwoods own the mines now. Elijah said. Confused. Much of the land was sold off during hard times. But according to these records, she turned to a legal document tucked between the pages. Your grandfather maintained certain rights even after selling portions of the original grant. Specifically, rights to any unique or previously undocumented mineral deposits discovered on or beneath the remaining Hayes property. Understanding dawned. So if there's something valuable under my grandfather's land, the Blackwoods can't mine it without your permission, even if their tunnels could reach it from adjoining properties. She closed the book. Mineral rights are complicated, Elijah, but they're also legally binding. Your grandfather understood this. I suspect that's why he refused to sell, no matter the price offered. But the mayor said he'll condemn the property as unsafe if I don't sell. He might try, Ms. Patterson acknowledged, but a property condemnation requires due process. It can't happen overnight, especially with historical properties. They spent the next hour reviewing town records, piecing together the valley's economic history. Pinewood had once been prosperous, first as a silver mining community, then as a timber producer. But as resources dwindled, so did opportunities. The discovery of coal had temporarily revived the local economy, but those seams too were now nearly depleted. Most young people leave after high school, Ms. Patterson said sadly. There's little to keep them here. The Blackwood Mining Company employs nearly 40% of the working adults in town. When those mines finally close, the town dies, Elijah finished quietly, unless something changes, unless a new opportunity emerges. She gave him a meaningful look. Your grandfather was working on something important, wasn't he? Something that could make a difference, Elijah nodded slowly. An invention that generates power without fuel. Clean energy from the atmosphere itself. Her eyes widened. That's what Edward Blackwood is after. Not just the land or minerals, but the invention too. Both, I think. There are special crystals under the mountain that make the invention work. The mayor wants to mine them, but he also wants to control the technology. Miss Patterson's expression hardened with resolve. Then we need to ensure he doesn't succeed. She pulled out a newer ledger, the minutes of recent town council meetings. Look here. 3 months ago, Mayor Blackwood proposed a new ordinance allowing expedited mining permits for strategic resource development. It passed with minimal discussion. She flipped forward several pages. And here, just last month, a motion to declare certain older properties as hazardous structures subject to immediate demolition. Your grandfather was still alive then, but very ill. He was planning this, Elijah realized. Waiting for my grandfather to die, then using these new rules to take the property. Politics is often about patience, Ms. Patterson said grimly. Edward Blackwood has been mayor for 15 years. He knows how to play the long game. As they continued researching, a pattern emerged, subtle legal maneuvers by the mayor, all seemingly designed to clear obstacles to acquiring the Hayes property. But the historical mineral rights remained a stumbling block he couldn't easily overcome. The town council meets tomorrow evening, Ms. Patterson said. I suspect the mayor will introduce some measure related to your property. We should be there. But what can I do? I'm just a kid. You're the legal heir to the Hayes property and all it contains, she corrected. And more importantly, you're the keeper of your grandfather's vision, a vision that might save this town in ways Edward Blackwood can't imagine. As Elijah prepared to leave, Ms. Patterson handed him a small, worn book titled Mineral Formations of the Appalachian Mountains. She had marked a page describing rare piezoelectric crystal formations found in certain isolated locations, crystals that could transform physical pressure into electrical energy. Your grandfather wasn't the first Hayes to recognize the mountain's true value, she said, but he might have been the first to fully understand how to harness it. I won't lie to you, son. Going up against Edward Blackwood is like wrestling a bear, Mr. Wilson said, pouring coffee for Ms. Patterson and a glass of lemonade for Elijah. They sat in the back room of his general store, where the old shopkeeper had listened intently to their discoveries. That man's had his fingers in every pie in this valley for 15 years. But you knew my grandfather, Elijah pressed. You knew he was working on something important. Mr. Wilson nodded slowly. Joshua Hayes was the smartest man I ever met. Folks around here thought he went peculiar, living up on that mountain alone. But those of us who knew him understood he was just focused. He set down his mug. What exactly did he build up there? Elijah described the workshop and the atmospheric energy converter, watching the old man's eyes widen with understanding. Clean energy from thin air, Mr. Wilson whispered. No wonder he kept it secret. He turned to Miss Patterson. And you say the Hayes family still holds the original mineral rights? According to town records, yes, she confirmed. Any unique mineral deposits on or below the remaining Hayes property belong to Elijah, regardless of who owns adjacent lands, which means Edward can't legally mine the crystals without Elijah's permission, Mr. Wilson concluded. But that won't stop him from trying to find a loophole or from condemning the property, Elijah added. He's already threatened to have the shack declared unsafe. Mr. Wilson stroked his chin thoughtfully. We could address that part at least. I've got lumber and supplies. A few of us old-timers could shore up that shack, make it sound as $1. Edward would have a harder time declaring it unsafe if it clearly isn't. Who else might help? Ms. Patterson asked. Frank Miller at the hardware store? His daughter can't find work since the sawmill closed. And old Doc Taylor, he treated your grandfather, Elijah. Respected him immensely. Mr. Wilson counted on his fingers. The Hendersons, the Clarks, more folks than you might think have reason to resent Blackwood's stranglehold on this town. By sundown, Elijah found himself surrounded by a small but determined group of townspeople at his grandfather's shack. Frank Miller brought his truck loaded with lumber and tools. Doc Taylor, despite his advanced age, inspected the structure with a professional eye, identifying key areas needing reinforcement. The Henderson brothers, former construction workers now employed sporadically by Blackwood Mining, lent their expertise and strong backs. My grandfather would be grateful, Elijah told them as they worked into the evening, replacing rotted boards, reinforcing walls, and patching the roof. He wanted his invention to help people, not just make money. Joshua always was a man of principle, Doc Taylor said, passing nails to Frank Miller as he secured a new support beam. It treated patients regardless of whether they could pay. A brilliant mind, big heart. As the repairs progressed, Elijah noticed the crew growing increasingly curious about what lay inside the shack. He had locked the hidden entrance to the workshop, but questions about his grandfather's invention persisted. It's not just talk, is it? Frank Miller asked during a water break. Joshua really built something that generates power without fuel? Elijah nodded. I've seen it work. A small version, anyway. He was building a larger one that could power much more. Power's expensive up here, Frank said thoughtfully. My daughter's trying to start a small business making furniture, but the equipment uses too much electricity for what she can afford. Something like that could make all the difference for folks trying to get by. Similar stories emerged throughout the evening. The struggle to afford heating during harsh mountain winters, businesses that couldn't expand due to energy costs, young people forced to leave the valley for opportunities elsewhere. This isn't just about your property, son, Mr. Wilson said quietly as they watched the others work. It's about the future of Pinewood Valley itself. By morning, the transformation was remarkable. The once dilapidated shack stood sound and secure, with a new front porch, reinforced walls, and a roof that wouldn't leak at the first rainfall. Mayor Blackwood would find it much harder to condemn on sight. As the impromptu work crew prepared to depart, Frank Miller approached Elijah with an unexpected gift, a petition already signed by everyone present. We, the undersigned, Elijah read aloud, support the preservation of the Hayes property as a historical site of scientific significance, and oppose any effort to seize or condemn said property against the owner's wishes. We'll gather more signatures in town, Frank explained. Not everyone will sign. Too many depend on Blackwood for their livelihood, but enough might to make the county commissioners take notice. Their small victory was short-lived. As the last helpers departed down the mountain path, Thomas appeared, his expression grim. "I came to warn you," he said, avoiding Elijah's eyes. "My father's furious about the repairs. He's called an emergency town council meeting for tonight instead of tomorrow. He's going to push through a resolution declaring this entire area unstable due to old mine tunnels beneath it." "But that's not true," Elijah protested. "The tunnels are sound. Your father's company still uses some of them." "He's presenting geological surveys that say otherwise." Thomas finally met Elijah's gaze. "Look, I'm still not sure whose side I'm on here, but you deserve to know what you're facing. My father's shut off your utilities, claimed non-payment, though I know that's not true. He's trying to make it impossible for you to stay here. Why tell me this?" Elijah asked suspiciously. Thomas hesitated. "Because what he's doing doesn't feel right, even if his reasons make sense to him." He started back down the path, then turned. "The meeting's at 7. If you're going to fight this, that's where the battle begins." After Thomas left, Elijah hurried inside to check the hidden entrance. The workshop remained undisturbed, but Thomas's warning had shaken him. The mayor was escalating his tactics, moving faster than they'd anticipated. He needed to reach Ms. Patterson and the others immediately. And somehow, before the council meeting that night, he needed proof. Irrefutable evidence that his grandfather's invention worked and could benefit the entire town. Otherwise, Mayor Blackwood's promises of mining jobs and immediate economic gains would sway even those sympathetic to Elijah's cause. Elijah raced against time in the hidden workshop, frantically studying his grandfather's notes for any clue that might help him restart the prototype without the original activation crystal. The substitute Thomas had returned was useless, a similar-looking stone with none of the special properties needed for the converter to function. The blue heart of the mountain, his grandfather had written repeatedly. The catalyst that bridges the gap between potential and kinetic energy. Without this crucial component, the atmospheric converter was just an elaborate arrangement of metal and wire. Impressive but inert, Elijah carefully examined the empty chamber where the crystal had been housed. The fitting was precision-crafted to hold a specific size and shape. Measurements in his grandfather's notebook indicated the original had been approximately 3 centimeters long. With a distinct hexagonal structure, a soft knock echoed from above, the signal he and Ms. Patterson had arranged. Climbing the stairs, he found not only his teacher, but also Mr. Wilson and Doc Taylor waiting in the shack. "The meeting's been moved up to 6, Ms. Patterson said without preamble. "We have even less time than we thought. And Edward's been busy," Mr. Wilson added grimly, "promising special tax considerations for businesses that support the mining expansion. Several folks who signed our petition this morning have already asked to have their names removed." "We need something compelling," Doc Taylor said, leaning on his cane. "Something to counter Blackwood's promises of immediate jobs and revenue." Elijah hesitated, then made a decision. These people had stood by him, risked the mayor's displeasure to help. "They deserve to know the truth. There's something I need to show you," he said, leading them to the hidden entrance. Their gasps echoed in the stairwell as he revealed his grandfather's secret workshop. "Good Lord," Doc Taylor whispered, moving slowly among the workbenches. "Joshua built all this?" While they explored in awe, Elijah explained the atmospheric converter and how Mayor Blackwood had taken the crucial activation crystal. "Without it, I can't prove the invention works," he concluded. "And without proof, why would anyone choose an uncertain future over the mayor's promises?" Mr. Wilson examined the prototype carefully. "This crystal, you're sure it came from this mountain?" "My grandfather's notes are specific. The formation is unique to this location. Something about the geological composition and pressure conditions. Blue crystals with hexagonal structure," Doc Taylor mused. "Found in these mountains." His eyes widened suddenly. "The Blue Caves." The others turned to him questioningly. "When I first came to Pinewood 50 years ago, the old silver mines were still operating," the doctor explained. "Treated a miner once who described chambers deep in the mountain where blue crystals grew from the walls. Called them the Blue Caves. Said they glowed faintly in the dark. Piezoelectric properties, Elijah said excitedly. They generate small electrical currents when under pressure. That's what my grandfather's notes describe. The old mines were sealed when the silver ran out, Mr. Wilson said. But Blackwood's company reopened some sections when they started coal operations. My father has the original crystal, came a voice from the stairway. Thomas stood there, somewhat breathless. But I know where to find more. Elijah tensed. Why should we trust you? Thomas stepped fully into the workshop. Because I've been thinking about what this invention could mean. Not just for you or my father, but for everyone here. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a mining company map. My father doesn't know I took this. It shows the current mining operations, but also the old silver mine tunnels, including some that haven't been reopened. He spread the map on a workbench. A section was circled in red, marked Geological Anomaly, Avoid Blasting. That's the crystal formation, Thomas explained. My father's engineers discovered it 3 years ago during exploratory drilling. They've been trying to extract samples through narrow boreholes to avoid disturbing the surrounding rock structure. That's why they want your land, to access it directly from above. But can we reach it from existing tunnels? Elijah asked, studying the map. Thomas traced a route with his finger. This service tunnel comes within 50 meters of the formation. It's not currently in use, but it should still be accessible. You're suggesting we enter the mines and extract a crystal ourselves, Ms. Patterson said, her tone making it clear how dangerous she considered this idea. It's trespassing, Mr. Wilson noted, and likely hazardous. It's our only chance, Elijah countered. Without a working crystal, we can't demonstrate the converter. Without a demonstration, no one will believe in its potential. I can get us in, Thomas offered. I know the guard schedules, the access codes. My father's been grooming me to take over the company someday. A bitter edge crept into his voice. I've spent more time in those mines than most of the workers. Why this change of heart? Doc Taylor asked directly. Yesterday you stood with your father. Thomas hesitated. Last night my father told me his full plans. Not just to mine the crystals, but to suppress your grandfather's invention entirely. He looked at Elijah. He plans to buy the patents, then shelve them, ensure they never reach production. He called it protecting existing market structures. Protecting his profits, he means, Mr. Wilson growled. Hundreds of jobs depend on those profits, Thomas said defensively, then sighed. But yes, he's thinking of the company first, not what this technology could mean for people who struggle with energy costs or for reducing environmental damage from mining. Elijah studied the map again. How difficult would it be to reach this crystal formation? The main challenge is avoiding detection, Thomas replied. The tunnels themselves are maintained for emergency access and ventilation. But we'd need to enter after the evening shift change, when the day crews are gone, but before the night security patrols begin. That gives us a window of less than an hour, Ms. Patterson calculated. Barely enough time to get in, locate a suitable crystal and get out. I'll go, Elijah said firmly. It's my grandfather's invention, my responsibility. You'll need help, Thomas insisted. I know the tunnels, the security systems. This is madness, Doc Taylor protested. Sending children into abandoned mines. Not abandoned, Thomas corrected. Unused but maintained. And we don't have a choice. The council meeting is in 4 hours. Without proof that this invention works, my father will convince everyone that his mining operation is the only viable future for Pinewood. Reluctantly, the adults recognized the truth in his words. They spent the next hour formulating a plan. Elijah and Thomas would enter the mine through a maintenance access point, while Miss Patterson and the others would gather as many supportive townspeople as possible for the council meeting. As Thomas outlined the route they would take on the map, Elijah caught his eye. If this is another trick... It's not, Thomas said quietly. Some things are more important than family loyalty. My father taught me that business comes first, but he never considered that I might apply that lesson to decide his business model is outdated. He offered his hand. Partners? After a moment's hesitation, Elijah shook it. Partners. Twilight cast long shadows across the valley as Elijah and Thomas approached the abandoned maintenance entrance to the Blackwood, mine located in a secluded ravine overgrown with kudzu and mountain laurel. The steel door was nearly invisible among the rocks and vegetation. Thomas produced a key from his pocket. "My father doesn't know I made a copy," he explained, working the rusted lock. "He gave me the original last year as part of my education in the family business." The door creaked open to reveal a narrow tunnel supported by timber beams. Thomas handed Elijah one of the two miners' helmets he'd brought, its headlamp providing a narrow beam of light in the encroaching darkness. "The main operations are 2 miles north," Thomas explained as they entered. "This access tunnel connects to the older network from the silver mining days. Hardly anyone comes this way anymore." The air grew cooler as they descended, heavy with the scent of damp earth and minerals. Their footsteps echoed eerily, the only sound besides the occasional drip of water from the tunnel ceiling. Elijah checked his watch. They had approximately 40 minutes before the night security sweep would begin. "Are you sure you know where we're going?" he whispered, his voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. Thomas nodded, consulting a small compass. "My father made sure I knew every inch of these mines. A Blackwood must understand the source of the family fortune," he always said. He led them to a junction where 3 tunnels diverged. "This way. The old silver workings are through here." The tunnel they entered was narrower, the timber supports older and stained with mineral deposits. As they progressed, Elijah noticed small blue veins running through the rock walls, traces of the crystal formation they sought. "We're getting close," Thomas murmured. "The main deposit should be just ahead." A deep rumble suddenly vibrated through the tunnel, sending small showers of dust and pebbles raining down on them. Both boys froze. "What was that?" Elijah whispered. Thomas's expression grew troubled. "Blasting. But there shouldn't be any operations in this section." Another rumble, stronger this time, shook the tunnel. "Something's wrong. They're mining in a restricted area." They pressed forward more urgently, the blue veins in the rock walls growing thicker and more numerous. The tunnel widened suddenly into a large chamber where their headlamps revealed an astonishing sight. The walls glittered with thousands of blue crystals, some as small as a fingernail, others as large as a fist. In the beams of their lights, the crystals seemed to pulse with an inner luminescence. "The blue caves," Elijah breathed in awe. Just like Doc Taylor described. Thomas approached the nearest wall, examining the crystal formation. "My father's reports described them as trace deposits. This is an entire vein." He turned to Elijah, his expression a mixture of wonder and betrayal. He lied about the extent of the formation. He's not interested in just a few crystals for research. He wants to extract the entire deposit. Another blast shook the chamber, closer this time, sending a shower of small crystals tinkling to the ground. A crack appeared in one of the supporting beams. "They're blasting directly into the formation," Thomas realized with alarm. "This whole section could collapse." Elijah quickly gathered several fallen crystals, searching for one with the hexagonal structure his grandfather's notes had described. "We need to get out of here now." A larger tremor shook the chamber, and with a splintering crack, one of the main support beams fractured. Rocks and debris began falling from the ceiling as the boys raced back toward the tunnel entrance. Just as they reached it, a massive rumble heralded a partial collapse, blocking their escape route with fallen rock. "We're trapped!" Thomas shouted, panic edging his voice as he attempted to shift the debris. Elijah forced himself to remain calm, remembering the mining map they had studied. "Wait, your map showed old ventilation shafts connecting to my grandfather's property. One should be nearby," Thomas nodded, gathering his composure. "You're right. There's an auxiliary tunnel that runs parallel to this one." He directed his headlamp beam around the chamber until he spotted a narrow opening almost hidden behind a crystal-studded outcropping. "There!" They squeezed through the opening into a lower, rougher tunnel that sloped gently upward. The blasting sounds grew more distant as they hurried along its length, guided by Thomas's recollection of the mine layout and Elijah's memory of his grandfather's map. After 20 minutes of tense navigation through increasingly unfamiliar passages, they emerged into a tunnel with cleaner air and newer support structures. "I recognize this section," Thomas said with relief. "We're in the northern quadrant now, away from the blasting zone, but still inside the mountain." The tunnel eventually led to a rusted metal ladder ascending into darkness. Above them, a circular hatch was set into the ceiling. "This must be one of the emergency exits," Thomas explained, testing the ladder's strength. "It should lead to the surface." The hatch resisted at first, years of disuse evident in its stubborn hinges. Both boys pushed with all their strength until it finally gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Cool night air rushed down, sweet and fresh after the stale atmosphere of the mine. They emerged onto the mountainside, stars twinkling in the clear night sky above. Elijah oriented himself, recognizing a familiar rock formation. "We're on my grandfather's property," he realized. "This exit must lead directly to—" His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. Counting his steps carefully, he moved about 50 yards upslope until he reached a particular configuration of boulders. Behind them, partially hidden by undergrowth, was a small wooden door built directly into the mountainside, an entrance his grandfather had disguised as part of the natural landscape. "Another way into the workshop," Elijah whispered, producing the key that opened all the shack's locks. The door swung inward to reveal a narrow passage sloping downward. Thomas stared in amazement. "Your grandfather really did think of everything. He built his workshop with multiple escape routes. The passage connected directly to the rear of the hidden laboratory." As they entered the familiar space, Elijah carefully examined the crystals he had gathered. One in particular matched the specifications in his grandfather's notes. A perfect hexagonal structure, approximately 3 centimeters in length, with the faint blue luminescence characteristic of piezoelectric properties. "This is it," he said, holding it up to the light. "This should work in the prototype." Thomas checked his watch. "The council meeting starts in 30 minutes. If we hurry, we might make it in time." As they rushed to prepare the prototype for transport, a final massive rumble shook the workshop, the most violent yet. Tools clattered to the floor, and a fine shower of dust sifted down from the ceiling. "That wasn't controlled blasting," Thomas said, his voice tight with worry. "That felt like a cave-in." Elijah secured the crystal in its housing within the prototype. "Whatever's happening in the mines, we need to get to that meeting. This might be our only chance to show everyone what my grandfather created and what your father is willing to destroy to keep it secret." Elijah and Thomas burst out of the shack, the portable prototype secured in a wooden crate between them, only to find a sheriff's deputy posting an official notice on the newly repaired door. "Condemning my property already?" Elijah demanded. Breathless from their hurried ascent from the workshop, the deputy turned, surprised. "Just serving notice, son. Property's being officially inspected tomorrow morning." He handed Elijah a document. "Emergency town council meeting tonight to review the situation." As the deputy departed down the mountain path, Thomas examined the notice. "A preliminary condemnation pending safety inspection," he read. "My father's not wasting any time. We need to hurry," Elijah said, tucking the document into his pocket. They made their way down the path as quickly as possible, while carefully handling the crate containing the prototype. The newly installed crystal fit perfectly in the housing, but they hadn't had time to test whether it functioned as the original had. "What if it doesn't work?" Thomas voiced the fear that had been growing in Elijah's mind. "It has to," Elijah replied with more confidence than he felt. "The formation is exactly what my grandfather described." The town hall stood at Pinewood Valley's center, its white clapboard exterior gleaming in the last rays of sunset. As they approached, they could see the building was already packed to capacity, with some townspeople standing outside. Listening through open windows, Miss Patterson spotted them from the steps and hurried over. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, her relief evident. "The mayor's already begun his presentation." "It's worse than we thought." Inside, Mayor Blackwood stood at the podium, indicating a large geological survey map displayed on an easel. Council members sat at a long table facing the audience, their expressions a mixture of concern and resignation. Substantial risk of subsidence affecting the entire north slope, the mayor was saying. Our engineers have identified critical instabilities in the old silver mine tunnels running beneath the Hayes property. Convenient timing, Mr. Wilson muttered from his seat near the back, where Elijah, Thomas and Miss Patterson joined him. Instabilities that were never mentioned before Edward wanted that land, the mayor continued, his voice carrying authority. The proposed solution is twofold. First, immediate condemnation of the unsafe structure currently occupying the site. He paused, making eye contact with various audience members. And second, incorporation of the property into Blackwood Mining Company's stabilization project. A middle-aged woman raised her hand. What exactly does this stabilization project involve, Mayor? An excellent question. Mrs. Cooper, our engineers will implement a comprehensive approach, including reinforced concrete injections to secure tunnel integrity. The mayor's practiced smile never wavered. As a secondary benefit, this process will allow safe extraction of certain mineral deposits that can create new jobs for our community. The crystals, Thomas whispered to Elijah. He's not mentioning them specifically. Another resident stood. What about the boy who owns the property? Seems he's fixed up that shack real nice. Doesn't look unsafe to me. Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Jenkins, the mayor replied smoothly. The structural integrity of the building is secondary to the dangerous ground beneath it. Moreover, he added, his tone softening with practiced concern, we must consider whether a miner living alone in such a remote location is in the child's best interest. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elijah felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he realized the mayor's strategy: attack the property's safety, then question his ability to care for himself, potentially removing his control over the inheritance entirely. I've drafted an emergency measure, Mayor Blackwood continued, holding up a document authorizing immediate action for public safety. All in favor? Point of order, Miss Patterson called, standing suddenly. Public comment is required before any vote. The mayor's smile tightened. Of course. Though I'd remind everyone that this is a matter of public safety requiring urgent action. Then you won't mind hearing from the property owner himself, Ms. Patterson said, gesturing to Elijah. All eyes turned to the boy as he stood, fighting the nervousness threatening to overwhelm him. Thomas gave him an encouraging nod as they carefully brought the crated prototype forward. My name is Elijah Hayes, he began, his voice initially wavering but growing stronger. The property you're discussing belongs to me, left by my grandfather, Joshua Hayes. He took a deep breath. Mayor Blackwood isn't telling you the whole truth about why he wants this land. The mayor's face darkened. This is hardly appropriate. Let the boy speak, called Mr. Jenkins from the audience, echoed by several others. My grandfather wasn't just living as a hermit on that mountain, Elijah continued. He was working on an invention, something that could change everything for Pinewood Valley. He and Thomas carefully set the crate on a table. Something that could provide clean, affordable energy without mining or pollution. Skeptical murmurs mixed with curious whispers as Elijah and Thomas unpacked the prototype, revealing the brass and copper apparatus with its central crystal chamber. This device converts atmospheric pressure and temperature differentials into electrical energy, Elijah explained, repeating the technical description from his grandfather's notes. It requires no fuel, creates no pollution, and can operate continuously in almost any climate. Mayor Blackwood's dismissive laugh cut through the room. A perpetual motion machine? This is absurd. The boy's grandfather was known for his eccentric ideas. It's not perpetual motion, Thomas interjected, surprising many with his opposition to his father. It harnesses energy that already exists in the atmosphere. The science is sound. I've seen it work. The mayor's expression hardened as he addressed his son. Thomas, this childish rebellion has gone far enough. Return to your seat. Not until they see the truth, Thomas replied, standing his ground beside Elijah. Elijah connected the final wires to the prototype. The audience watched with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity as he made adjustments according to his grandfather's specifications. The crystal in the central chamber caught the light, its blue facets glinting. "That's what this is really about," Elijah said, pointing to the crystal. "These rare formations exist beneath my grandfather's property. Mayor Blackwood doesn't care about safety. He wants to mine these crystals for profit, while suppressing the technology my grandfather invented." "Preposterous!" the mayor sputtered. But a flicker of concern crossed his face as he recognized the crystal. Elijah reached for the activation switch, heart pounding. Everything depended on this moment, proving his grandfather's invention worked, exposing the mayor's true motives, securing his inheritance. His hand hesitated over the switch. What if the crystal wasn't quite right? What if some crucial adjustment was missing from his grandfather's notes? What if, after everything, the prototype failed to function? Thomas seemed to sense his doubt. "It will work," he said quietly. "Your grandfather was a genius. Trust his design." Elijah took a deep breath and flipped the switch. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. The prototype sat silent and still as the crowded town hall held its collective breath. Mayor Blackwood's face began to shift from concern to triumph. Then a faint hum emanated from the device. The blue crystal in the central chamber began to glow, softly at first, then with increasing brightness. Gauges on the control panel flickered to life, and the copper coils surrounding the crystal chamber took on a subtle blue luminescence of their own. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Elijah connected a small array of light bulbs to the output terminals, and one by one they illuminated, casting a warm glow across the astonished faces of the council members. "It's generating electricity," Elijah explained, his voice steadying with growing confidence. "Not from fuel or batteries, but from the temperature and pressure differentials in the air itself. My grandfather called it the atmospheric energy converter." Thomas stepped forward. "I've seen the engineering principles. It's revolutionary technology. The prototype can power basic appliances, but a full-scale version could generate enough electricity for dozens of homes, perhaps the entire town." The mayor recovered quickly. "A clever science project, certainly, but hardly practical on any meaningful scale. The energy needs of a modern community could be met with larger versions," Elijah interrupted, drawing from his grandfather's notes. "The prototype generates approximately 500 watts. A unit the size of a small shed could produce 50 kilowatts, enough for several houses. A facility the size of the town hall could power the entire valley." An excited murmur spread through the crowd. Mr. Jenkins called out, "And it needs no fuel at all. No coal or gas?" "None," Elijah confirmed. "It runs continuously, drawing energy from natural atmospheric conditions. The only unique component is this." He indicated the glowing crystal. "A piezoelectric crystal formation found only in specific geological conditions, like those beneath my grandfather's property." Mayor Blackwood moved to regain control of the meeting. "Even if this device works as claimed, which I'm not convinced it does, developing it into practical technology would take years. My company offers immediate jobs, tax revenue, community stability. At what cost?" Ms. Patterson rose to her feet. "Continued environmental damage from mining operations, dependency on a single industry and a single company, and the suppression of an innovation that could transform our community's future." The mayor's expression hardened. "Let's be realistic. Blackwood Mining currently employs over 40% of this town's workforce. Would you risk those jobs for an unproven invention by a man known for his eccentricities?" A heavy silence fell as the reality of the situation sank in. No matter how impressive the demonstration, the immediate economic concerns weighed heavily on a community that had struggled for decades. Frank Miller, the hardware store owner, rose slowly. "My family's been in this valley for 4 generations, watched it thrive with silver mining, decline when the veins ran dry, survive on timber until that played out too. Now we cling to coal, knowing those seams are thinning every year." He gestured to the glowing prototype. "If this is real, if it works, it could be the first industry we've had that doesn't depend on tearing something from the ground until there's nothing left. It's a child's inheritance." The mayor countered dismissively. "Not an industrial development plan." "Then perhaps we should develop one," suggested Mrs. Cooper, the town librarian. "A community initiative to research and expand this technology. Something that benefits everyone, not just Blackwood mining." The mayor's face reddened. "The town lacks the resources for such an undertaking, and I remind the council that we're here to address an urgent safety concern, not indulge in technological fantasies." "About that safety concern," Thomas interjected, his voice steady despite his father's glare. "While retrieving a crystal sample tonight, Elijah and I witnessed unauthorized blasting in the restricted crystal formation area. The instabilities your engineers reported weren't pre-existing. They were created by your own mining operations." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The mayor's composure slipped momentarily before he regained control. "That's a serious accusation, Thomas. One you cannot substantiate." "Actually, he can," came a new voice from the back of the hall. All heads turned to see a man in the dust-covered uniform of a mine safety inspector. "Brent Wilson, County Mine Safety Commission. Received reports of unauthorized blasting and was conducting an inspection when I encountered a significant collapse. In the north section, exactly where mining operations are. Prohibited due to proximity to the crystal formation." The inspector approached the council table, depositing a thick folder before them. "My preliminary findings indicate willful violation of safety protocols, endangering both workers and surrounding properties. I've ordered all operations suspended pending full investigation." Mayor Blackwood's face had gone ashen. "This is absurd. You've exceeded your authority. 3 miners were injured in tonight's collapse, Edward," the inspector cut in sharply. "Could have been much worse. This isn't about property rights anymore. It's about criminal negligence." The revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. Council members huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Through it all, the prototype continued to hum steadily, its lights glowing with unwavering brightness, physical proof of an alternative future. Councilwoman Elaine Richards, who had been silent until now, addressed Elijah directly. "Young man, what exactly do you propose be done with your grandfather's invention?" It was the question Elijah had been pondering since discovering the hidden workshop. Looking at the expectant faces surrounding him, he realized his answer would shape not just his future, but potentially that of the entire valley. "My grandfather could have sold this technology for millions," he said thoughtfully. "He chose not to because he believed it should benefit everyone, not just enrich a few. I think he would want it developed here in Pinewood Valley, creating opportunities that don't require destroying the mountain that made it possible." "A noble sentiment," Mayor Blackwood interjected, attempting to regain control. "But the practical realities could be addressed through community partnership," Ms. Patterson suggested. "The school has grant applications prepared for rural technology initiatives. With a working prototype, we'd be strong candidates." Mr. Wilson nodded enthusiastically. "And my brother in the state capital has connections with university engineering programs, always looking for innovation projects." As more townspeople offered suggestions and resources, Elijah felt a growing sense of possibility. The mayor watched with thinly veiled frustration as the momentum shifted decisively away from his mining proposal. Councilwoman Richards tapped her gavel for attention. "I move that we table the condemnation measure, pending full investigation of both the mining safety violations and the potential of this new technology. Further, I suggest we form a community committee to explore development options that include Mr. Hayes's invention." The motion passed unanimously, despite Mayor Blackwood's objections. As the meeting adjourned, townspeople crowded around the prototype, asking questions and offering congratulations. Thomas stood apart from the celebration, his expression conflicted as he watched his father storm from the hall. "You did the right thing," Elijah told him quietly. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe, but I just upended my entire future. My father won't forgive this easily. Then help build a different future, Elijah suggested. One that doesn't depend on his approval or his mines. The morning after the town hall meeting, Pinewood Valley buzzed with animated discussions. Groups gathered on street corners and in the general store, debating the previous night's revelations. The prototype had captured imaginations, but practical concerns remained. Mayor Blackwood's supporters emphasized the immediate jobs that mining provided, while others dreamed aloud about a future powered by Joshua Hayes's invention. Elijah sat with Ms. Patterson and Mr. Wilson at the small cafe near the town square, reviewing the hastily formed community committee's notes. The euphoria of the previous evening had given way to sobering reality. University researchers are interested, Ms. Patterson said, scanning an email on her tablet. But they want to examine the full-scale plans, not just the prototype. Mr. Wilson frowned. And the state development grant requires matching funds from the community. Funds we don't have. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Thomas entered. Conversations halted briefly as townspeople noted the mayor's son, their expressions ranging from approval to open hostility. He slid into the booth beside Elijah, his face drawn from lack of sleep. My father's been on the phone all morning, he reported quietly, calling in favors, making threats. He's not giving up. What kind of threats? Elijah asked, alarmed. Legal challenges to your inheritance. Questions about the safety of the technology. Pressure on council members who have business ties to the mining company. Thomas ran a hand through his disheveled hair. And he's organizing a town meeting for this afternoon. His own meeting, with free lunch provided by the company. Buying support with sandwiches, Mr. Wilson scoffed. It's more than sandwiches, Thomas replied. He's promising immediate bonuses to all mine employees who attend and support the company position, and suggesting that opposing his plans could mean layoffs. Ms. Patterson's expression grew troubled. That's effective leverage in a town where nearly half the workers depend on those mines. The cafe door opened again, admitting Frank Miller from the hardware store. He approached their table with an apologetic expression. Just wanted you to know, he said to Elijah. Some folks are withdrawing their signatures from our petition. Can't blame them, really. Got families to feed, mortgages to pay. Outside the window, a small truck drove by with a newly mounted loudspeaker announcing, "Community meeting at the Blackwood Mining Picnic Grounds. Free lunch for all attendees. Come hear the truth about our town's future." Elijah's heart sank. The momentum from last night was already slipping away as economic realities reasserted themselves. "We need to show them this isn't just a dream," he said. "We need to demonstrate what the full-scale converter could mean in practical terms. That would require building it first," Thomas pointed out, "which needs funding, materials, expertise, and time," Mr. Wilson added. "Time the town might not have if your father accelerates his plans." Miss Patterson tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. "We need to put this to a vote. A formal, binding community decision, not just a council recommendation. My father will still have significant influence," Thomas began. "But at least it would be transparent," she countered. "Everyone's position on record, the community's will clearly expressed." Mr. Wilson nodded slowly. "A special referendum could work. Would need council approval, though." Councilwoman Richards seemed supportive, Elijah said hopefully. "1 vote out of 5, Thomas reminded him. "And my father has close relationships with Councilman Parker and Tanner." Their discussion was interrupted by Councilwoman Richards herself, who entered the cafe with a purposeful stride and made directly for their table. "Good. You're all here," she said without preamble. "The situation has escalated. Mayor Blackwood has called for an emergency council session at 3 o'clock to revisit the condemnation measure." "He can't," Ms. Patterson protested. "The motion was tabled pending investigation. He's claiming new evidence of structural instability," Richards explained grimly. "And he's brought in a county inspector, one from outside our district, with connections to mining interests." Elijah felt the walls closing in. So he'll get his inspector to declare my property unsafe, the council will vote to condemn it, and everything my grandfather built will be destroyed. Not if we can prove the property is sound and the technology viable, Councilwoman Richards replied. But we need more than just the prototype. We need a comprehensive plan showing how this invention could realistically benefit the community. By 3 o'clock? Thomas asked incredulously. That's impossible. The councilwoman's expression remained determined. Nothing is impossible when a community's future hangs in the balance. Gather whatever documentation you have on the full-scale converter. Find evidence of the property's structural integrity. And now, she added, glancing at Thomas, any proof of your father's company creating the instabilities they're now using as justification would be particularly helpful. As she departed, the small group exchanged worried looks. The prototype, while impressive, was just a demonstration model. The full-scale converter existed only in Joshua Hayes's plans and notes, not as a functioning reality. And with the mayor's considerable influence over the council, even the most compelling presentation might not be enough. We need to get back to the workshop, Elijah decided. Gather everything, all the plans, all the notes. If we can't build the full converter by this afternoon, we can at least show exactly how it would work and what it would mean for Pinewood. Outside the cafe, a crowd had gathered around the announcement truck, where a company representative was distributing flyers highlighting the economic benefits of expanded mining operations. Several mine workers in uniform stood nearby, their expressions making clear their position on the matter. As Elijah and the others left the cafe, hostile stares followed them. What had seemed like a unifying discovery the previous evening had, in the cold light of day, become yet another division in a town already struggling with its identity and future. Your father works fast, Elijah muttered to Thomas as they passed a group of miners. He's fighting for survival, Thomas replied quietly. If your grandfather's invention becomes reality, it eventually makes the mines obsolete. He can't allow that to happen, even if it means destroying something that could help everyone in the long run. Thomas's expression was grim, especially then. My father always says, long-term vision is a luxury for those who control the present. He looked at the divided townspeople around them, and right now he's making sure he maintains that control. The council chamber had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled, with additional townspeople standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. At the front, Mayor Blackwood sat with the 4 other council members, his confident smile suggesting the outcome was already decided. Beside him, a grey-suited man with a county inspector's badge waited to present his findings. Elijah, Thomas, Ms. Patterson and Mr. Wilson occupied the front row, surrounded by stacks of Joshua Hayes' plans, notes and technical diagrams. The prototype sat on a small table before them, humming softly as its blue crystal powered the small array of lights. They had spent the afternoon gathering every piece of evidence they could find, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling it wouldn't be enough. Mayor Blackwood called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. This emergency session will address the urgent safety concerns regarding the Hayes property following new structural assessments. He nodded to the inspector. Mr. Daniels, your findings? The inspector stepped forward, unrolling a large geological survey map. My examination reveals critical instabilities in the tunnel network beneath the Hayes property. The risk of catastrophic subsidence is significant and immediate. That's because your company created those instabilities with unauthorized blasting. Thomas called out, rising to his feet. The mayor's face tightened. My son refers to unsubstantiated accusations made last night. I remind the council that the county mine safety investigation remains ongoing, with no official findings issued. Convenient timing, Mr. Wilson muttered. Mayor Blackwood continued smoothly. Given these documented safety risks, I move that we proceed with the condemnation measure previously tabled and authorize immediate action to secure the site. Councilman Parker, a longtime mining company ally, quickly seconded the motion. The safety of our community must come first. Before we vote, Councilwoman Richards interjected, Mr. Hayes has prepared information about his grandfather's invention and its potential benefits to our community. The mayor's smile remained fixed. While we appreciate the boy's enthusiasm for his grandfather's hobby project, this meeting concerns public safety, not theoretical technologies. It's not theoretical, Elijah insisted, standing. The prototype works. The full-scale plans are complete. This could transform Pinewood Valley's future. Into what, exactly? Mayor Blackwood challenged. A research facility requiring years of development before producing a single job. Meanwhile, my company offers immediate employment, tax revenue, community stability. Elijah faltered. The mayor was right about the timeline. Developing the converter would take years, while the mines employed people now. He glanced at the expectant faces around him, including many miners whose livelihoods depended on Blackwood mining. Before he could respond, the door at the back of the chamber opened. A distinguished older man in an impeccable suit entered, accompanied by Mr. Wilson's brother from the state capitol. The newcomer surveyed the room, then walked confidently to the front. Walter Harrington, he announced, addressing the council. Harrington, Blackwell and Associates, attorneys at law. I represent the estate of Joshua Hayes. Mayor Blackwood's smile vanished. This proceeding doesn't require legal representation. On the contrary, Harrington interrupted smoothly. When a miner's inheritance is threatened, legal representation is not only appropriate, but required. He placed a leather portfolio on the table. I've been the executor of Joshua Hayes' estate for the past 20 years, managing his considerable assets according to his explicit instructions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elijah stared at the attorney in confusion. Considerable assets? But my grandfather lived so simply. Harrington smiled kindly at the boy. Your grandfather was many things, Elijah, but poor was not among them. He withdrew a stack of documents from his portfolio. Joshua Hayes held 27 patents for various mechanical and electrical innovations. While he chose not to commercialize his atmospheric energy converter, his earlier inventions were licensed to manufacturing companies worldwide, generating substantial royalties. He handed a document to Elijah. This is a statement of the trust established in your name. The current balance is approximately $8 million, with quarterly royalty payments continuing to accrue. Gasps and exclamations filled the chamber. Elijah stared at the figures in disbelief. All this time, while living in a modest house in town and later in the simple mountain shack, his grandfather had been wealthy. That's impossible, Mayor Blackwood sputtered. Joshua Hayes lived like a pauper. He lived according to his values, Harrington corrected, choosing simplicity and privacy over ostentation. But he was far from impoverished. The attorney turned back to Elijah. Your grandfather stipulated that you were not to be informed of the trust until you had discovered his workshop and understood his final invention. He wanted you to appreciate the value of his work, not just its financial rewards. Elijah's mind reeled as he tried to process this revelation. But why didn't he develop the converter himself? With these resources, he could have built it years ago. Because of the second stipulation in his will, Harrington explained, producing another document. The atmospheric energy converter cannot be patented or owned by any individual or corporation. Instead, it must be developed as a community resource, with benefits distributed equitably to all residents of Pinewood Valley. He addressed the stunned council members. Joshua Hayes envisioned a research and production facility built on his property, employing local workers and providing clean, affordable energy to the region. His trust allocates substantial funding to establish this facility, contingent upon community participation and support. Mayor Blackwood had gone pale. This changes nothing about the safety concerns. As to those, Harrington continued unruffled, I've taken the liberty of commissioning an independent structural assessment from state geological authorities. He distributed copies of a report to each council member. Their findings indicate no natural instabilities in the area. Any recent structural concerns would necessarily result from human activity, such as unauthorized blasting in restricted areas. The mayor's composure cracked. These so-called findings are irrelevant. The council has procedures, protocols, which I'm sure they'll follow diligently, Harrington agreed pleasantly. Just as the state attorney general's office will follow their protocols in investigating potential criminal negligence in mining, operations following yesterday's accidents. The implied threat hung in the air. Councilwoman Richards broke the tense silence. I believe these developments warrant further consideration before any vote on condemnation. I move that we table the mayor's motion and establish a special committee to explore the community development potential of the Hayes invention. Seconded, Councilman Davis said quickly, sensing the shifting winds. Mayor Blackwood looked around desperately, but found little support, even from his usual allies. The motion to table passed 4-1, with only the mayor dissenting. As the meeting adjourned in a buzz of excited conversation, Elijah approached Attorney Harrington, still trying to process everything he'd learned. My grandfather had millions, but he let people mock him as a crazy old man living in a shack. Harrington smiled gently. Your grandfather understood something many never learn. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or public opinion, but in the impact of one's life work. He could have lived lavishly, but chose instead to create something that might change the world. He placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. He was waiting for you to discover that same truth on your own terms. Thomas joined them, his expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. So what happens now? Elijah looked from the attorney to Ms. Patterson, Mr. Wilson, and the other supporters who had stood by him. Then to the wider community, still buzzing with excited conversation about possibilities none had imagined just days ago. Now, Elijah said, finding his voice, we build what my grandfather envisioned. Not just a machine, but a future. 6 months later, Elijah stood on the newly constructed observation deck that extended from what had once been his grandfather's modest shack. The structure had been preserved and renovated, now serving as both his home and the administrative office for the Hayes Institute for Sustainable Energy. From this vantage point, he could see the entire operation taking shape on the mountainside below. The foundation of the main research facility had been completed, with steel framework rising to form what would eventually house laboratories, manufacturing space, and educational areas. Former miners, retrained as construction workers and technicians, moved purposefully across the site. The first full-scale atmospheric energy converter, 3 times the size of the prototype, stood operational nearby, providing power for the entire construction project. Quite a change from the worthless shack everyone mocked you for inheriting, Miss Patterson observed, joining him at the railing. Now serving as the Institute's educational director, she had developed programs to train local residents in the technical skills needed for the growing enterprise. My grandfather would have loved seeing this, Elijah replied, watching a team install the distinctive blue crystal array that formed the converter's heart. The past 6 months had transformed not just the mountainside, but the entire valley. The revelation of Joshua Hayes's trust fund and his vision for community development had sparked a renaissance in Pinewood. While Blackwood mining continued operations on a reduced scale, many workers had transitioned to positions with the Hayes Institute. Finding more stable and safer employment, Mayor Blackwood had resigned 2 months after the council meeting, following the state's investigation into the mining safety violations. He had departed for the city, leaving behind a divided legacy and a mining company now under new management with stricter environmental oversight. The first residential power connections go live next week, said a familiar voice as Thomas joined them on the deck. After the dramatic council meeting, He had faced a difficult choice between family loyalty and his own principles. Ultimately, he had chosen to stay in Pinewood, accepting a position as technical liaison between the Hayes Institute and the remaining mining operations. His relationship with his father remained strained, but he had found unexpected purpose in helping integrate the new technology with existing infrastructure. His understanding of both worlds, his father's traditional industry and Elijah's innovative approach, made him uniquely valuable to the transition. 27 homes in the first phase. Thomas continued, consulting his tablet. Mostly elderly residents with the highest energy costs. The difference in their monthly expenses will be significant, just as my grandfather intended, Elijah said with satisfaction. Energy that serves people, not profits. Though only 13 now, Elijah had grown tremendously in confidence and purpose. With Attorney Harrington's guidance and a board of community trustees, he was learning to manage both his inheritance and his grandfather's legacy. He attended school in the mornings and spent afternoons at the Institute, where his natural aptitude for engineering was flourishing under the mentorship of university researchers who had flocked to the revolutionary project. The governor's office confirmed for the ribbon-cutting ceremony next month, Ms. Patterson noted, and 3 more universities have requested research partnerships. What had begun as one man's solitary vision was evolving into a collaborative endeavor that transcended any single individual. Joshua Hayes had understood this, preparing the way and then stepping aside for others to carry forward. Mr. Wilson approached, accompanied by visitors in business attire, representatives from a neighboring community interested in adopting the technology. As Pinewood Valley's economic development coordinator, he had embraced his role as ambassador for the new enterprise. These folks are from Riverdale, he announced. They heard about our project and wanted to see it firsthand. As Elijah welcomed the visitors and began explaining the technology, he noticed Frank Miller's daughter among the construction team below. Her furniture-making business had been one of the first to benefit from the affordable energy provided by the initial converter, allowing her to operate power tools that had previously been too costly to run. Now she divided her time between her growing workshop in town and installing cabinetry in the new facility. Throughout the valley, similar stories of renewal were unfolding. The general store had expanded to supply the growing workforce. The cafe had hired additional staff to meet increased demand. Even the school had added specialized technical courses in anticipation of future employment needs. Not everything had been smooth. Some residents still resented the disruption to traditional industries. Others worried the changes were happening too quickly. The transition remained challenging for families deeply connected to mining for generations. But the community was finding its way forward together, balancing respect for its past with hope for its future. As evening approached, Elijah excused himself from the visitors and walked to the small memorial garden established beside the original shack. There, a simple stone marker commemorated Joshua Hayes, inscribed with words from his journal. True innovation serves not the innovator, but humanity. Beside the marker stood the original prototype, preserved under glass, the catalyst that had transformed mockery into respect, isolation into community, and a seemingly worthless inheritance into a priceless legacy. Elijah placed a hand on the cool glass, remembering the moment he had first turned the key in the shack's lock, unaware of the treasure waiting to be discovered. His grandfather had left him far more than a dilapidated building or even a revolutionary invention. He had bequeathed a purpose, one that would shape not just Elijah's life, but countless others. From somewhere in the valley, a bell tolled the hour. Lights began to illuminate across the construction site as workers completed their day's efforts. In homes throughout Pinewood, families gathered for evening meals, their conversations inevitably touching on the changes unfolding around them. Change that had begun with an orphaned boy, a ruined shack, and the remarkable secret it contained. "Thank you, grandfather," Elijah whispered to the quiet mountainside. "I'll make you proud." As if in answer, the prototype's crystal seemed to pulse briefly with an inner light, a trick of the setting sun, perhaps, or something more. Either way, Elijah smiled, filled with certainty that the legacy he had inherited would continue to grow, bringing light to places that had known too much darkness for too long.